Civil liberties are rights guaranteed by the Constitution, such as freedom of religion, expression, and assembly. In 1942, Fred Korematsu, a 23-year-old Japanese American living in California, disobeyed the order to leave behind his day-to-day life and report to a relocation camp with other citizens of Japanese ancestry following the attack on Pearl Harbor. He challenged the order because he felt it violated the Fifth Amendment right to due process and therefore his civil liberties, a challenge that went all the way to the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus United States. Fred was arrested and convicted, and he lost at the Supreme Court. How does that Supreme Court decision impact our society today? What lessons can we learn from our history? We're honored that Dr. Karen Korematsu of the Korematsu Institute and Fred's daughter joins us today to share her father's story and to discuss the importance of protecting civil liberties. ACTEC fellow Hung Nguyen will get us started.
Dr. Korematsu, thank you for being with us today. You share a famous last name with a major U.S. Supreme Court decision, which I would say is actually infamous. Can you tell us how you are related to the main body in that case?
My father was Fred Korematsu, who had the infamous or landmark Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States. And my father was born in Oakland, California, so he was an American citizen and lived till he was actually 86 years old and passed away in 2005.
What happened in Korematsu versus the United States?
With the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, of course, the U.S. went into the war against Japan. And President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, which actually gave the military the ability to forcibly remove anyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. This was half of Washington to the west, if you start with the demarcation line starting in Canada, down through Oregon to the west, all of California, and half of Arizona to the west. And it didn't matter if you were even born in this country or an American citizen. You basically only had maybe a few days to decide what you were going to take with you, because you had to leave everything behind, sell it on 10 cents on the dollar. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't even know the weather conditions, and you didn't know when you were coming back. And so in that case, my father thought this was wrong. Also because all due process of law was denied with this executive order. No one had access to an attorney. No one was even charged with a crime. And no one had their day in court. So my father thought this was wrong, that he was an American citizen. He learned about the Constitution in high school and thought he had rights as an American citizen. And so he decided not to report to a detention assembly center, prison center, like his family. He was living in San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland, California. San Leandro was where he was arrested. And 30 days later, on May 30th, 1942, just a little over 80 years ago. And he was sent to a federal jail in San Francisco, and he had a visitor, Mr. Ernest Bessick, who was then the executive director of the Northern California affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union, who was looking for a test case because he thought it was unconstitutional, and visited my father in jail and asked my dad if he'd be willing to take his case, if need be, all the way to the Supreme Court. And my father thought for sure by the time it reached the Supreme Court that they would see it was unconstitutional. So he always had that hope.
So when the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, did they side with your father?
No, unfortunately not. On December 18th, 1944, they still ruled against him. However, it was not unanimous. It was a 6-3 decision, and the three dissenting opinions are most important and relevant today. Justice Robert Jackson referred to my father's case as this lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for anyone to pick up and use with a plausible cause. I'm paraphrasing. And actually, after 9/11, 2001, Attorney General Ashcroft cited my father's Supreme Court case as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps. Justice Owen Roberts, not related to Chief Justice, said it was unconstitutional. And Justice Murphy referred to the incarceration as the ugly abyss of racism.
What happened to your family and families like yours of Japanese ancestry during this period of time and after the U.S. Supreme Court decision?
They were forcibly removed from their homes. They could only, take with them what they could carry in two hands, and first were sent to converted racetracks. San Francisco Bay Area was Tanforan, a racetrack that was converted into a prison camp. All they did was whitewash the walls, put an iron cot in it, army blankets, light bulb, dirt on the floor, but it still smelled like manure. And we treat animals better than we treated the Japanese Americans, because the story of the Japanese American incarceration really is the inhumanity that was against them. And they had to live that way for 3 or 4 months before they were sent off to one of the 10 permanent, so to speak, Japanese American concentration camps across this country until the end of the war. The other detention assembly centers were up and down the West Coast, either racetracks or converted horse stalls on fairgrounds or sports centers. So this is, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly removed from their homes and to live in these kinds of conditions until the end of the war. Now, the government knew that the Japanese Americans were not dangerous, so community leaders from outside helped people get jobs if they could go east. You couldn't go west until the end of the war, but you could go east. My father went to Detroit, Michigan, eventually, and so that's what happened to them. And then at the end of the war, the Japanese Americans were only given $25 and a bus ticket, and that was it to kind of to start over their lives.
During this period of time, were families uprooted and were they separated when they were sent to the internment camps?
The day after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, over 2,000 Japanese nationals were picked up by the FBI and sent off to Department of Justice camps. They were just stripped away from their families, and the families didn't even know where they were going. They were dangerous people like Buddhist priests and teachers who were teaching Japanese language, community leaders. I mean, those type of dangerous people. And to be noted, there was never any evidence of any spying or espionage on the West Coast. I mean, that was what was learned after my father's case was reopened in 1983. And so this was the outright racism that was happening at the time. And part of the backstory was even agriculture, because many of the farmers and up and down the West Coast, when the Japanese nationals, Issei, first generation, like my grandfather, were doing well in agriculture, it was the same old story. Well, they're taking away our jobs. Send them back to Japan. We've done that to the Chinese when they were doing well and working on our railroads. And we've even done that for, Hispanics coming up from Mexico and South America to work in our fields to help us grow our agriculture in this country.
Your father's conviction was eventually overturned in 1983. I believe that the trial court found that the US government hid evidence that would have been exculpatory in terms of the dangers imposed by Japanese Americans on the West Coast. Can you talk about that case a little bit?
Yes, actually, it was Professor Peter Irons, who was a legal historian and lawyer, was doing research in DC as he was wanting to write a book about the World War II Supreme Court cases. And he found the evidence, along with another researcher, Aiko Hershig Yoshinaga, that proved that there was no reason for the Japanese Americans to be incarcerated. At the time of my father's Supreme Court hearing in December 18th, 1944, the government, or the Department of Justice, actually had lied to the Supreme Court, had altered evidence, and destroyed evidence. So always beware. And on that basis, they were able to reopen my father's case, along with two other Supreme Court cases, Hirabayashi and Yasui. Those had to do with the curfew. My father's case was disobeying the military orders, and that's how his case was reopened on that evidence.
So while this conviction was overturned, there has been debate regarding whether the Supreme Court decision in Korematsu versus US is still good law, especially because of the decision in Trump v. Hawaii. Can you talk about that?
Yes, actually, next year will be the 40th anniversary of my father's Coram Nobis legal case, or the Coram Nobis cases. Coram Nobis, in case some of you don't know, because it is a little unknown procedure, but the evidence was lied to the courts, and so my father's conviction was vacated in 1983. So he no longer had a federal prison record, but the Supreme Court case still stood. So the Supreme Court can only overrule itself. So when the Muslim ban was issued on January 27th, 2017, after that time, the Attorney General of Hawaii decided to fight this against the president in Trump versus Hawaii, because it was clearly religious profiling. It was banning the Muslims, and Arabs from coming into this country. And at first, they called it I should note, they called it the Muslim ban. Well, of course, then there was a lot of pushback in this country. And then they called it the immigration ban. Well, that didn't go over very well. Then they decided, well, okay, we'll include Venezuela, and we'll just call it the travel ban. And so this is how these euphemisms and what happens to this country and how it gets discounted. And so when Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, said he of course upheld the Muslim travel ban, but because I was asked to submit an amicus brief and a Friends of the Court brief, along with the other two children of Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui, it was to remind the court of my father's Supreme Court case and the other cases, and the dangers of overreaching of power. That there is a reason that we have, the different branches of government, and so because Justice Sotomayor had issued her really scathing dissenting opinion that referred to my amicus brief, and reminded the courts of Korematsu versus United States. Chief Justice Roberts gave an opinion. He said, well, Korematsu is overruled in the court of history, but it did not have anything to do with the majority opinion in the Muslim travel ban. It was what we call in law dicta. It was his opinion. So therefore, Korematsu versus the United States still stands. It's certainly been discredited, but it can be used in another Supreme Court case as precedent, depending, of course, on what it is.
What would you say is your father's legacy, and what lessons can we learn from the Korematsu history that apply to today?
When now we have a special day that's in honor of my father. It's Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution. It's important to emphasize it's about our civil liberties and the Constitution, and the emphasis is on our civics and participation in that importance. And that's the way my father led his life. It's on his birthday of January 30th. States, California was first, Hawaii, Virginia, Florida, New York City, and even Arizona governors signed the bill earlier this year that establishes the day in perpetuity and an opportunity for education, a push for civic participation. But and we hope other states will follow. It's not a holiday yet. Working on that, but it's going to take other states to come along. But my father, what he said, and I'll quote, is to stand up for what is right and don't be afraid to speak up. Certainly, that's what the Attorney General of Hawaii felt when he decided to fight the case in court. And the lesson is also how one person can make a difference in the face of adversity. My father was not supported by his own Japanese American community when he was sent over to the Tanforan racetrack, the Assembly Prison Center, after his arrest, all through the time of his even going to the incarceration camp in Topaz, Utah, where he and his family were. This was 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry that were denied any type of due process. And he fought this in hopes that he would always be able to reopen up his case. And even at the time in 1983, because of the redress and reparations movement, his Japanese American community said to him, well, Fred, if you reopen up your case, you may, that and lose, then you're going to hurt our chances for redress and reparations. And because my father's didn't listen to anyone, but he was never bitter or angry. He never blamed anyone. He felt that the government was wrong and he was right to take a stand. And that's what he crisscrossed this country, trying to educate people so that something like the Japanese American incarceration wouldn't happen again, because he was so afraid that it would. And we need to learn to respect each other. I never thought we'd get to this point in my lifetime where we'd have to talk about that or even teach children that we can agree to disagree, to find those principles that we do agree on and to work from there. And because we all love this country, we all want best for our communities, we all want best for our families. And there is such a divide, and the hate and violence that we're seeing now against African Americans and Asian Americans has got to stop. That we all need to be accountable, that it's not somebody else's problem. That everyone, what I say is also that I learned from my father is to be part of the solution, not the problem. And if we all work together, if we all had that conversation of sharing our own stories, as my father did, and to appreciate each other's differences and not to be afraid of them, because prejudice is ignorance. And our most powerful tool that we have is education. That's what we do at the Korematsu Institute, Fred T. Korematsu Institute here in San Francisco. We're a national organization. We work with teachers, educators, and my age range of audience are kindergartners to judges. This is why my father's legacy resonates on so many different levels, because it's about social justice. It's about about upholding our diversity and inclusion and equity, so we can try to eliminate this violence. And also, just to speak to what's happening now in social media, to understand that 70% of the misinformation and disinformation is retweeted and sent across our social media. So we all need to question what we hear and not take for granted somebody else's opinion, that we need to learn what the facts are and be truthful ourselves.
Thank you very much, Dr. Korematsu, for being here today, for educating us, for enlightening us, and for your continued work for social justice.
My pleasure. Stand up for what is right.
As Dr. Korematsu said passionately, be part of the solution. Educate yourself about social justice. Question the information you read on social media and be mindful of what you share. Do not be a passive observer when you notice racism and injustice. Stand up for what's right. Please visit actec.org/diversity for more information and resources on this topic, and make sure you subscribe to ACTEC's YouTube channel to be informed of new videos as they become available.